We are going to be talking about free trade agreements and the future of free trade agreements under the democratically controlled Congress. And Alan Tonelson of the U.S. Business Industry Council. First, tell me what you think the current, categorize the current situation with regard to free trade agreements in the United States, and then tell me what you think their future is under the democratically controlled Congress.
The U.S. has followed a fundamentally new trade policy really since NAFTA back in the early 1990s, something that we never tried before. Before that, U.S. trade policy was largely about opening foreign markets for U.S.-made goods, expanding exports, therefore expanding total demand for U.S. products, increasing job levels, and increasing wages. But with NAFTA, a new model of trade policy making took hold, and the main aim, as far as we can tell, has been outsourcing production and sending jobs overseas to low-wage, low-regulation locations like Mexico and China, not to service those markets, which were advertised as big, rapidly growing markets for U.S.-made products, but to service the U.S. market from these very low-wage, very low-regulation production sites. And the results have been stagnant manufacturing production for about 7 years now, more than 3 million manufacturing jobs lost, and whopping trade deficits that undercut America's financial health.
So what do you see as the future of free trade agreements with the democratically controlled Congress?
Certainly there's more skepticism in this Congress about current trade policies than there was in the Republican-controlled Congress. In fact, quite a few of the new Democratic freshmen made trade policy and critiques of current trade policy a pretty important part of their campaign platforms. At the same time, the critique seems to be rather narrow. It seems to be focused on the absence of what they call enforceable protections for labor rights and for environmental considerations. And those are all worthy goals, but trade policy, U.S. trade policy, needs a much more thoroughgoing overhaul in order to become a friend of U.S.-based production once again, rather than an engine of outsourcing.
Christopher Wenk of the National Association of Manufacturers, categorize for us, in your opinion, the current state of trade agreements in the United States, and what's the future look like under this democratically controlled Congress?
Well, I have to say, I'm actually pretty optimistic about moving forward on free trade agreements. Since the election, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Charlie Rangel, and the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Max Baucus, have both signaled a willingness to work with the administration to move forward the trade agenda. The situation is very fluid right now as we speak. USTR Ambassador Susan Schwab is meeting with Chairman Rangel and Mr. McCreary to work out a deal on labor, a model on for labor rights to incorporate into free trade agreements that are pending with Peru, Colombia, and Panama. And I do believe that that will happen here in the next couple of months. And I am confident that we'll be able to move the trade agenda forward, even under a Democratic-controlled Congress.
Our current largest trading partner is the Chinese. We have a huge trade deficit with them. What does that say about our economy, and are we in a safe position with regard to that trade deficit?
Well, you know, the trade deficit is a big problem. We certainly acknowledge that. I think it is very notable. If you look at the manufactured goods trade deficit, which just came out last week, of the trade deficit, $530 billion is manufactured goods. But of that total, only $30 billion of that is with NAFTA and our FTA partners. The rest of it is with Asia and the rest of the world, and most of that is with China. There is no question that we need to address the trade imbalance with China. You know, we are very concerned about currency manipulation. We're very concerned about subsidies. We're very pleased that USTR has filed a case against China on their subsidies last week. And intellectual property protection is another area that we need to address with the Chinese, but it is definitely a concern.
Alan Tonelson, how do you see the trade imbalance with China, and what effect is it having on the U.S. economy?
It's a symptom of the larger problems in U.S. trade policy. It's also a reflection of how outsourcing focused this trade policy has actually been. When this country was making its big decisions about expanding trade with China back in the 1990s and letting China into the World Trade Organization back in 2000, we were told, in fact, by the multinational companies that run the National Association of Manufacturers, that this was going to be an enormous expanding market for U.S.-made products and a real boon for U.S. workers and U.S. wages. It's turned out exactly the opposite, because when these multinational companies looked at China, they didn't see 1.2 billion consumers, because the Chinese people, the typical Chinese worker, earns next to nothing. What they saw were 1.2 billion workers. And by expanding the workforce that was available to them, they were able to exert tremendous downward wage pressure on their remaining U.S. workers. Plus, the fact that we run such an enormous deficit with China means that we are heavily reliant on Chinese financing to maintain our standard of living, which is a very dangerous situation.
We're talking about free trade agreements with Christopher Wenk of the National Association of Manufacturers and Alan Tonelson of the U.S. Business Industry Council. And if you'd like to get involved in the discussion, in the conversation, the numbers there on the screen, 202-737-0001 for Republicans, 202-737-0002 for Democrats, and independents can call us at 202-628-0205. Our first call comes from Cleves, Ohio, on our line for Democrats. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much for Washington Journal. I listen every morning since I retired.
God bless you.
I'm very concerned. I know that we no longer have manufacturing in this country anymore. At one time, we were a great country. We manufactured everything that we needed. We manufactured most that other people needed. Now, all we are is a service industry. We only have minimum wage jobs. I have grandchildren who are in high school, and even if we could afford college, I don't think that they could get a job to where they could be self-supporting the way I was and the way that their parents. My question comment is, I would like to see 100% tariff on everything that is brought into this country. If it was manufactured here and we paid $1 for a widget when it was manufactured here, then I think that that widget, when it comes back into this country, should cost $2. All the taxes that we no longer reap, federal taxes, state taxes, and small communities who no longer have all that manufacturing that was here in this country. And then the money that's left over after the taxes are paid for the people, then the people who no longer have a job, who now are working 2 and 3 minimum wage part-time jobs, that money should go to them.
Thanks for your call, ma'am. Christopher Wenk.
Yeah, well, I would just like to say that, I think that it is important to realize that manufacturing still is the backbone of the U.S. economy. I mean, upwards of 80% of our exports from the United States are manufactured goods. And in terms of addressing some of the concerns with regards to manufacturing, the NAM, in conjunction with the Manufacturing Institute, just did a study that shows that right off the bat, U.S. manufacturers are at a 33% price disadvantage because of all the structural costs that are imposed by the U.S. government, whether it be pensions, healthcare costs, taxes. So right off the bat, U.S. manufacturing is already off to a very disadvantaged start. And in terms of addressing some of the challenges with regards to manufacturing, one way to start would be to address some of these concerns, these 33% additional costs.
Our next call comes from Chicago, Illinois, on our line for Republicans. Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen. The gentleman who just spoke, Wink. So are you saying that pensions should be abolished? Are you saying that pensions should not be paid as promised? And I hope for your answer, because I have another question as well.
I'm not saying that at all, sir. I'm just saying that some of these additional costs are really having an impact on the competitiveness of U.S. manufacturing. And absolutely not. I'm not saying that we should get rid of pensions. They are absolutely a critical part of any workplace. It's certainly companies that offer them should continue to offer them. But just the additional costs need to be looked at if there are ways that we can reduce the cost to help manufacturers remain healthy.
Oh, I do appreciate your answer, because certainly I was hoping you weren't suggesting that we work for slave wages as many in China do. That said, many in Congress, many in my party, I'm ashamed to say, are nothing but corporate whores. Tax-exempt status, offshore status. I mean, it's a cycle of lunacy. I hire all American citizens. I check for Social Security cards. I pay out of my pocket to do background checks. My business runs above board. Others in my trade, they don't care. They don't give a damn. They'll put a pregnant Mexican mom out if they could. This country is spiraling down, and under Reagan and others, manufacturing, the destruction of unions, this country's catching hell. Many of us grew up under union households.
Chicago, what kind of business are you in? Chicago, what kind of...
I'm in construction, and construction is one of the toughest businesses to maintain above board, hiring legal citizens.
Alan Tonelson of the U.S. Business Industry Council. Go ahead.
First of all, I'd have to say that that's the kind of company that should join my organization, because we're also very active trying to bring our out-of-control immigration system under some kind of rational order. And this caller is absolutely right. Companies that try to play by the rules are totally disadvantaged. But I do have to say that Chris's group, the National Association of Manufacturers, has been complaining about regulatory costs and tax costs and pension costs for a long, long time now. But our last caller really put his finger right on it. What they're really complaining about is the fact that the United States has become a first world country. That since the 1930s, we've decided to follow a certain formula that's brought us first world living standards and first world social protections and first world environmental protections, not third world levels. This is an achievement we should be proud of, and the notion that the only way that we can become competitive is to move closer to Chinese levels is something that's absolutely shocking and completely unacceptable politically.
Naperville, Illinois, on our line for independence. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. I've got a question. I think Mr. Tonelson will be in a better position to respond to it. But Alan Greenspan, for a long time, always said that our monetary policy was to fight inflation, except when he lowered the rates, housing prices shot up, which to me looks like inflation. And I'd like to know if you think this is another symptom of catering to these large companies. For example, when they did ship our jobs overseas as opposed to opening the Chinese market. And how do you think this will play out in the future? Because the money that was tied up in real estate, which could be drawn out to support our economy, is pretty much tapped out now.
My main worry about former Fed Chairman Greenspan's policies, which have continued right through to his successor, Mr. Bernanke, has to do with exactly what you just said. They, since 9/11, they essentially oversaw the pouring of hundreds of billions of dollars of stimulus, government stimulus, into the American economy in the form primarily of very low interest rates, which, as you very rightly pointed out, created a housing bubble and, in fact, inflated many asset bubbles. And this inflation is not counted in the U.S. government's inflation measures. It really should be. But even more fundamentally, it has helped to further addict our economy to growing by debt rather than growing through its own earnings. And the higher and higher our trade deficits grow, the higher and higher our accumulated national debts rise, the more debt-hooked our economy becomes, and the more danger we put future generations into, because eventually those debts have to get paid off.
Christopher Wink of the National Association of Manufacturers. Your response?
Oh, I'd just like to quickly point out that I know I hear a lot about offshoring and sending jobs overseas, and I think it's very important to note that if you look at American manufacturing investment in 2005, U.S. manufacturers invested about $170 billion in factories and equipment in the United States in 2005, while their foreign direct investment outflows to the rest of the world were only $39 billion. So that what it comes down to is that over 80% of U.S. manufacturing investment is in the United States. So I mean, I know I understand people are concerned about jobs being shipped overseas, but the reality is that in terms of American manufacturing, most of the investment is happening here in the United States, over 80% of it.
And yet, if you ask yourself, what are they actually buying with those investment dollars? Increasingly, they're buying foreign-made capital goods. Plus, this investment at home has been artificially inflated by the fact that the Fed's very loose money policy for such a long time, even well after an economic recovery began, has made borrowing costs very cheap. But these are artificially low levels, and what we're worried about is when this tide of cheap money recedes, the very grave structural weaknesses of the U.S. economy and the U.S. manufacturing base, which has also been kept at an artificially high level, will become exposed.
We're talking about free trade agreements. Back to the phones in Derry, New Hampshire on our line for Republicans. Good morning.
Good morning, guys. Hey, how are you? Look, I was raised as in the Cold War zone where we just didn't do business with communists. And the idea that we are actually propping up a communist regime in China and they take our money and do subversive things around the globe that we totally don't like that cost us even more money is absolutely absurd. Could you explain to just a regular American who grew up, under the guise that we never did business with communists because we had to crush them, how we are propping up a communist regime?
Christopher Wink.
Yeah, well, thank you, caller, for your question. I think that, the concerns that you raise, I can understand where you're coming from. The most important thing is that China is a member of the world community, i.e. China is a member of the World Trade Organization. And my association that I work for, we were very supportive of bringing China into the World Trade Organization because within the WTO, they have agreed to abide by commitments under the WTO. And if we're going to hold China to task for any of these laws that they are possibly breaking or concerns that we have, the best way to do it is within a framework like the WTO. So, if they were outside the WTO, we would have no leverage over China. Since they are in the WTO, we do have leverage over them.
But here's the big problem. China has also been identified by the U.S. Defense Department as the biggest potential threat to U.S. national security interests, not only in East Asia, but worldwide. And this comes straight from a Defense Department white paper. The U.S. multinational manufacturing sector has not only spearheaded and aggressively pushed for policies that have poured tens of billions of dollars of investment into China, it's also pushed for technology transfers that have given China America's very best militarily relevant technologies. And in fact, we all read a few weeks ago how the Chinese successfully tested an anti-satellite weapon. Much of that technology came from the American aerospace industry. That's a very dangerous policy. Not to say that China is the next Nazi Germany or even the next Soviet Union, but even the American Defense Department, the Bush administration Defense Department worries that China's future is very uncertain, and our toward China, which have been pouring hundreds of billions of dollars of capital and technology into this economy that's clearly not our friend, is a very reckless policy, and it's got to be reversed very quickly.
According to the U.S. Department of Commerce, the U.S. exports to China in 2006 were greater than U.S. exports to India, Brazil, and France combined. Back to the phones, Garrettsville, Ohio, on our line for Democrats. Good morning.
Hi. One of the questions, I'm up in years, so I lived through World War II. One of the biggest things that nobody ever talks about, we be able to tool up in 6 months to defend ourselves the way FDR could do, with all these manufacturing places gone, and we don't even manufacture steel. How could we do what we did in World War II? That bothers me a lot. I'll listen to you.
Mr. Wank?
Yes, well, I mean, man, I still believe that, there still is a very vibrant steel industry in the United States. You just mentioned the steel industry. They the steel industry is a member of the NAM, and I still believe that manufacturing is still very healthy and strong in the United States. Productivity is very high, and I do believe that we still are, the most sought-after manufacturing industry in the world is right here in the United States of America, ma'am.
And Sterling, let's go to the phone. Sterling, Virginia, on our line for Republicans. Good morning.
Thank you. I'm curious. We never hear about the ramifications of the environmental effects that we have on moving our manufacturing overseas. And this is of grave concern because of the problems we have in the world with pollution. And it's not really saving us money if they're polluting over there, because that's the whole world. That's not just a local sort of deal.
Alan Tonelson.
Well, one of the reasons that U.S. manufacturers love to manufacture in places like China and Mexico is because even if they have environmental laws on their books, they're not enforced, because they feel that further modernization, further growth, and creating more employment for their own people is much more important. So the more U.S. trade policy pushes American-based manufacturing into low-wage, low-regulation countries like this, clearly the dirtier our air and water will actually be.
Alan Tonelson is a research fellow at the U.S. Business Industry Council. He's also a research associate at the George Washington University Center for International Science and Technology, and as a Henry L. Stimson Center visiting fellow in China. He was. Okay. Christopher Wenk, in addition to being the International Trade Policy Director at the National Association of Manufacturers, before joining that, he spent 5 years working on Capitol Hill as the working for the House Small Business Committee under Congressman Steve Chabot and Congressman Dave Camp of Michigan. He was a senior member of the House Ways and Means Committee, and he also interned at the delegation of the European Commission in Washington, D.C. We've been talking for the most part about trade deficit with China. Let me ask you, how does our trade compare, the trade deficit or the trade balance compare with our European partners, and what effect is that having on our economies on both sides of the Atlantic?
Well, thank you for your question. Certainly, if you look at our trade deficit, our biggest trade deficit is with China. You know, there's no question that that is above and beyond where most of our trade deficit is. We do have a trade deficit with the European Union as well, although it has been declining. Actually, the numbers that came out last week shows that they are declining. I think that the value of the dollar has something to do with that the euro has been increasing and the value of the dollar has been decreasing. But you know, we still have a huge, vibrant trading relationship with the European Union. But by and large, most of our trade deficit is with China.
Alan Tonelson, your characterization of our trade balance with Europe?
It's much higher. Our trade deficit with Europe is much higher than it should be. The U.S. dollar has become weaker versus the euro, certainly since early 2002, when the value of the U.S. dollar against most of the world's major currencies actually peaked. And yet our trade deficit with the so-called Eurozone countries, those countries that do use the euro, has remained way too high. What's also strange about this is that we're constantly being told that in terms of manufacturing and competitiveness, Europe is yesterday's meatloaf. They're not competitive, they have too many regulations, their workers earn way too much money, they're lazy, they take 7-week vacations, and yet this hopelessly uncompetitive European economy is beating America's supposedly world-class manufacturing in this U.S. market, in European markets, and in third markets also. It's a very strange situation.
We're talking about free trade agreements. Louisville, Texas, good morning.
Good morning, C-SPAN. I think that Bill Clinton, when he pushed NAFTA, did it out of humanitarian reasons. But it has been such a hard thing for American workers to adjust to this that I've just wondered, I've been curious, because I voted for him, because I thought he had the best grasp of the worldwide economic situation of any candidate for president that I'd voted for in a lifetime. And then I have a comment.
Christopher Wenk.
Yeah, well, thank you for your call, ma'am. You know, I believe that we are still fighting NAFTA. I know I hear this all the time, that NAFTA was so bad, but you know, if you look at the statistics, it just is not the case. 46 out of the 50 states, NAFTA is their #1 export market. And as I mentioned earlier in the show, if you look at our overall manufactured goods trade deficit of $530 billion, $30 billion of that is with NAFTA and our other FTA partners. And if you look at even within NAFTA itself, our trade deficit with NAFTA, 70% of that is oil imports. And I know that in this country we talk a lot about wanting to reduce our dependence on foreign oil from the Middle East for a very good reason. But we get a lot of our oil from Mexico and Canada. I don't think that people realize that. So I think we are still fighting NAFTA, but at the end of the day, NAFTA has been a very positive thing for the U.S. economy. And if you look at the figures and you look at the rhetoric, they just do not match up.
Mobile, Alabama, on our line for independence. Good morning.
Hi, how are you doing?
Just fine, sir. Go right ahead.
I just want to make a comment. General Electric, they're fixing, they manufacture jet engines, and they're fixing to produce most of those in China now. There was a thing in, it might have been Business Week, or I'm trying to remember what magazine, but what's the downside to that? Because it's so much cheaper to manufacture in China, and the CEO gets a bigger raise. I mean, Americans just aren't competitive, and they have, it's expensive to hire Americans. They're not productive. So, I mean, what's the downside for a company to manufacture in China? I mean, you're going to save a lot of money doing that. So,
thanks for your call, Alan Tonelson.
Well, the problem with manufacturing in China is that most of the various factors that go into determining Chinese competitiveness versus U.S. are not the products of free market forces, because China is not a free market economy by a long shot, for all the hype that we've heard for the last 25 years, and despite lots of very real structural change that has gone on. But China has a long way to go before it's an even substantially free market economy. So when we talk about Chinese competitiveness versus U.S., we have to recognize that China's government has been tilting that playing field and actively working to create Chinese advantage. The U.S. government doesn't respond at all, even when China's practices clearly violate international trade law, U.S. trade law, and common commercial norms. But one thing that jet engine manufacturers ought to be thinking about very carefully is the longer they manufacture in China, the more manufacturing in China they actually do, the likelier their core intellectual property is to be stolen.
We get this email from Len Charlap in Princeton, New Jersey. Would you ask your guests about the contribution globalization has on the greatest economic problem of the U.S., namely the increasing inequality in both income and wealth? First, Alan Tomlinson.
What I'm worried about most is not so much the rising rich-poor gap, which is a very real problem, but it's the nature of this rising rich-poor gap. And what we've seen is not the very wealthier getting wealthier at a much more rapid pace than the rest of us, but even the rest of us perhaps still becoming wealthier, but the wealthier getting richer, while the middle class and poor are either stagnating in terms of their incomes or getting poorer. So we're having the great majority of the American workforce has become worse off, especially in the last 30 or so years of globalization, than it had been before. And one thing we need to keep in mind is that we have had wage stagnation or decline, again, for the great majority of U.S. workers for more than 35 years now. That's never before happened in U.S. economic history, and it started just about the time that the American economy began to open itself up wide open to imports from all over the world.
Christopher Wank.
Well, thank you for your the question. Globalization is here to stay, and I know that there are a lot of anxieties across America about the impact of trade on the U.S. economy, on jobs, and I think that, right now we are kind of at a crossroads in U.S. trade policy. This is really going to give us a real opportunity to take a look at these. I know that Chairman Rangel of the House Ways and Means Committee and Chairman Baucus of the Senate Finance Committee are going to be holding a lot of hearings in the next couple of months to look at some of the challenges that globalization is having on the U.S. economy and how we can address some of these concerns. For example, Trade Adjustment Assistance for Workers is a very important program. That program expires later this year. I know that the Bush administration has put in their budget request to increase funding for this program. And there are going to be a variety of other issues that are going to be looked at by this Congress. And I think this will be a very good opportunity to take a look at some of the anxieties that there are across the world.
Our next call for Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Good morning.
Good morning. My main concern is China. I consider China to be potentially and probably our enemy. I understand that they even make components for our weapon systems, our great weapon systems, our smart bombs. And the fact that we need them, how can we ever defend ourselves from them? And I also think that Mr. Wank and people like him are traitors to this country. Benedict Arnold was a better American than you. Thank
Why
you.
do you say that he's a traitor, sir?
Because their main goal is to make the rich richer. I mean, business people want to rule the world, and countries, governments are becoming subsidiaries of theirs. It's happening in Europe. It's happening here. They want to get rid of our border with Mexico and Canada. And the United States as an entity, as an independent free nation, is about to disappear from the face of the earth.
Christopher Wink.
Well, with all due respect, sir, I am certainly not a trader. I work for the oldest industrial trade association in the United States. We represent U.S. manufacturing. Each and every one of our companies employs hundreds of thousands of workers across the country. So, with all due respect, what I do on a daily basis is push the agenda of U.S. manufacturing, and our agenda is to make U.S. manufacturing as competitive as possible. I understand your concerns about China. You're certainly entitled to those concerns. What I would like to do is find a way to address the trade deficit with China, and one way would be to address the issues that I mentioned earlier: currency manipulation, subsidies, and counterfeiting. But at the end of the day, we cannot hold China to task for any of the violations that they may be doing if they're not within a world trade body like the World Trade Organization. If they're outside that system, then we can't hold them to any leverage whatsoever.
According to the Congressional Research Service, we have pending U.S. free trade agreements with free trade areas of the Americas, the Southern African Customs Union, Thailand, Andean nations, Panama, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, South Korea, and Malaysia. Alan Tonelson of the U.S. Business Industry Council, of that list that we just put up there, which do you see as the most critical as the agreement that the U.S. needs to tie up or to boost?
I find all of them worthless because they're all part of the problem, and the problem is a trade strategy that has focused almost exclusively since NAFTA on countries that are either too poor or too broke or too small or too deeply in the debt or too protectionist or some combination of those traits to become major net customers, major net importers of U.S.-made products for generations. So the main aim of expanding trade with those countries clearly can't be to expand U.S. exports and create more jobs and more wealth here. It must be to accelerate outsourcing, because those countries are most attractive to the multinational companies that run Chris's organization, not because they're big end-use markets for U.S. products. The purchasing power just isn't there. It's because they offer very cheap workforces and almost regulation-free environments for supplying the U.S. market, and that's why our trade deficit keeps growing and growing and growing, because we don't focus on countries and regions where you do have high incomes. That's not part of the agenda at all, it seems.
Pontiac, Michigan, on our line for Democrats. Good morning.
Good morning. Hi, I'd like to thank you for having C-SPAN. My first comment is that free trade isn't free. You need to put an X across the free. And Mr. Wink, you got the right name, but you should wink every time you speak, because you're only trying to fool the American public. You said it yourself. You work for the oldest corporation, manufacturing corporation, which tells me that it has to be the most powerful one. Mr. Townsend, you got a lot of things right. I'm not going to pretend I know a lot about business, but you speak the truth, sir, and you keep doing what you do.
Thank you so much.
Christopher Wink.
Well, I feel like I'm being beat up many times by your callers this morning, but I'd be happy to answer. A couple of things. First of all, I've been hearing a couple of times here about the NAM and multinational corporations. The most important thing to realize is that most of our member companies are small and medium-sized manufacturers. 90% of our members are small and medium-sized companies. So to say that I represent a bunch of multinational companies is just not true whatsoever. And I just would like to say a couple things about these free trade agreements that you posted earlier. They are all very important. And I think that people don't realize that 70% of imports that come into the United States come in duty-free. We are such an open market. That is just the bottom line. And these free trade agreements are about leveling the playing field for our companies, for our workers, for our farmers. And let's take a quick example. Peru. 90% of their imports come to the United States duty-free because of a preference program we put in place 20 years ago. Why is it not fair to give our companies and our workers the same market access to their country that they have into ours? We are a completely open market. And at the end of the day, 95% of the world's population lives outside the United States. There are opportunities for exporting products around the world, and most of them are outside the United States.
But half of them earn $2 a day or less, and most of the rest aren't doing much better. And Peru has a 55% poverty rate. So there is no market there whatever.
Let's go to Mariana, Florida, on our line for Republicans. Good morning.
Yeah, this is Amos Reed. I have noticed this right here. In America, there's a lot of unjust weights and unjust balances being practiced in America. From where I sit and what I've seen is this, that manufacturing in America is very scarce. It might be in some key areas, but like a lot of in Florida, a lot of areas I've been through, a lot of observations, manufacturing here is very scarce. I have no problem with free trade. But the thing is right here is, if we can benefit our own citizens to have growth potential for buying houses, buying cars, without them work, and fact about taxation without representation. The people in the Republic of America, they're not represented by the companies. They're not represented by people in the U.S. government.
Let's take this last call from Brookfield, Connecticut. Good morning.
Gentlemen, give me a second here. It's kind of complex. I've been doing business in China since 1988, and the culture over there is, it's very different than the way the U.S. does business. One of the things that we should put the spotlight on is, first of all, the fact that for some reason, culturally, the Chinese tend to yes everyone to death when you want to do business over there. They will say yes, and they don't even understand what that word means. And then they don't take responsibility for failures in their efforts because of the Chinese space. And what that does is that makes it difficult to get certain tasks accomplished because you're trying to solve a problem, and when someone won't admit responsibility for it, that can make your management challenges a lot more difficult. So the impact of that is that while we go over there for cheaper labor and cheaper raw materials, the micromanagement costs tend to go up. So that's one aspect to doing business over there that I think is not correctly accounted for when people are looking at the cost-benefit analysis. And then the danger, and I think China is going to become a danger to America in a lot of ways because of this cultural quality, but they learned it from us because prior to doing business in China and throughout my career, I've also worked at Fortune 100 companies, and the corruption that I've witnessed firsthand at very senior levels, it's endemic in American business. And now I have a small business, and I see it even as a small business that not only just the costs you have to pay legitimately, but the hidden costs that are really due in part to just there's no other way to put it, but corruption and greed, and this is like the failure of our American national identity and ethos. That
Brookfield, thank you very much. We're going to have to cut it off there. Christopher Wink, address his concerns about the cultural differences and corruption.
Well, I think, caller, it's you raised some good points, and I think without a doubt, China offers challenges and opportunities, and there certainly are some cultural differences, and I think that at the end of the day, we have a long way to go in terms of bridging some of those cultural gaps. At the end of the day, it's a very complex relationship, the U.S.-China relationship. A lot of the callers that have called in have raised a lot of concerns. A lot of them are valid. But we think that the best way to address them is to take these challenges head on and address them, whether it's through the World Trade Organization or through the International Monetary Fund and other institutions like that.
Alan Tonelson, address the caller's concerns about cheap labor.
The problem, or I should say the challenge that China poses to us is not only cheap labor, but it's cheap labor combined with rather good and rapidly rising levels of productivity, as well as numerous Chinese government subsidies that are very difficult to identify and its highly legalistic, completely naive approach to solving trade policy problems that all combine to tremendously and artificially reduce the cost of producing products in China to the disadvantage not only of U.S. workers and U.S.-based companies, but creating tremendous dangers for the entire global economy with trade and investment imbalances which have never before been seen in world history and which are threatening a major financial crack-up if they're not addressed very soon and very aggressively.
Alan Tonelson of the U.S. Business Industry Council is also the author of The Race to the Bottom: Why a Worldwide Worker Surplus and Uncontrolled Free Trade Are Sinking American Living Standards. Christopher Wenk is the National Association of Manufacturers International Trade Policy Director. Gentlemen, thank you both for being on the program.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.
In just a few minutes after the break, we're going to be talking with Marianne Lavelle of U.S. News and World Report. She is co-author of this special report, Overselling Ethanol, and we'll be back in just a few seconds.
A discussion on the Bush presidency and White House press coverage is coming up tonight. Press Secretary Tony Snow is joined by a panel of members of the White House Press Corps, including NBC's David Gregory, Terry Hunt of the Associated Press, Mark Knoller with CBS News, and Cheryl Stolberg of the New York Times. That's live at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN. Middle and high school students, get your entries ready for C-SPAN's 2007 Student Cam National Video Competition. Pick a current political topic of interest to you, and using some C-SPAN video, produce a video documentary of 10 minutes or less. The grand prize winner will receive $3,000, and 45 prizes will be awarded overall, with the top entries airing on the C-SPAN networks. To learn more and for entry forms, go to studentcam.org. Entries must be received no later than March 30th. C-SPAN's 2007 Student Cam National Video Competition. What political issue matters to you? On C-SPAN and online, Capital News provides timely and relevant updates about Congress, politics, and public affairs. Look for Capital News updates every 15 minutes at the bottom of your screen throughout the day. And find out more about the stories behind the headlines, along with video of the day's highlights, online at capitalnews.org. On C-SPAN and online, let Capital News keep you up to date on what's happening in Washington, politics,